Did you hear what he did now? This one's really the worst. How often do we respond with a jump in our pulse rate, an eager gleam in the eye, and a kind of leaning forward in our cubicle when someone stops by with the latest gossip? The boss did what? And the irony is that we're actually rooting for something bad to have happened. That same certain someone messes up again, and we revel in his or her mistake. Even if we pay part of the price for the bad judgment happening upstairs, it almost seems worth it if we can smugly keep reconfirming our low opinion of Mr. Big. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4, we find 4 words that sting our souls. Does not envy. Then just a couple lines down in verse 6 is a companion challenge. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. Can we possibly succeed at fulfilling both definitions? Love doesn't envy, and true agape love doesn't delight in evil. It's rather interesting how those two problems go together. In a September 1996 article in the Washington Post, Robert O'Hara Jr. tells about a marching band competition for schools in the Virginia area under the headline, "Downbeat Band Directors Strike Sour Note at Contest." Apparently, when a certain high school received the second place trophy at the statewide competition, the director didn't accept it with a song in his heart. The 31-year-old director took the trophy and in front of the hundreds of students and parents there on the football field, walked over and threw it into a trash can. The marching band's deputy director then intervened, but not to rescue the situation. No, he began arguing with the judges too, telling them his musicians deserved first place, not second. When an official from another school went over to the trash can and retrieved the silver trophy, both directors refused to take it or even to touch it. One educational official said afterward that it was a display of poor sportsmanship right up there with the infamous Roberto Alomar. Remember spitting on the umpire incident during the last week of the baseball season that same year? Now, why did such a thing happen? Why did this high school, one of the premier institutions for academically gifted students and first in the country for producing national merit semifinalists, why'd they have to suspend 2 grown-up men? The answer is envy, pure and simple. They couldn't stand for another school to have their first place trophy. The success of the other institution angered them. I can only imagine the diatribe, the shouting that took place between that band director and the judges. I'm sure part of his red-faced spiel had to do with the real and imagined flaws in the winning school's performance. The envy often links itself with fault-finding, with rejoicing and reveling in the failures of others. We cover up our jealousies by spray painting graffiti over our rivals' accomplishments. Well, it certainly shows up in politics. Back during the early 1970s, the entire United States public began to absolutely feed on Watergate news. It became a mania, a fixation. People wanted bad news to happen because gossiping was so much fun. They reacted this way even though it meant that their own government was paralyzed, its foreign policy stagnating, the economy hurting, and problems getting unattended. Although our democratic system was unraveling, people couldn't stop salivating over the real or imagined crimes of Richard Milhous Nixon and all of his co-conspirators at CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. In Gerald Ford's book, A Time to Heal, he bares his soul about why he finally decided to pardon his predecessor, Nixon. He knew that it would be a volatile thing to do, politically speaking. Nixon haters would have a field day. Reporters would castigate him on the evening news. But it was largely the public frenzy for wrongdoing that made him realize that only a presidential pardon could close the door on Watergate. Only he, Gerald Ford, had the constitutional authority to make people stop delighting in evil, as the Apostle Paul wrote almost 2,000 years earlier. And we could say a lot about the 2020 election. Remember the political hate campaign between Vice President Biden and President Trump? Or between the news media? I shared already the suggestion that we as Christians should probably read 1 Corinthians 13 every single day of our lives. True love doesn't envy. True Christian love doesn't rejoice in evil. The Living Bible renders verse 5 this way: does not hold grudges and will hardly even notice when others do it wrong. Not only do we notice when someone does us wrong, we sense injury even when it hasn't happened. How can we learn to hate envy, to stop rejoicing in the sins and mistakes of others? Maybe one more Nixon-era story will help shed some light. In Chuck Colson's first book, Born Again, in which he describes his own conversion experience, he relates how things were at the height of Watergate before his conversion. Of course, he was right in the thick of it. His name was in the headlines almost every day, and his political enemies loved to envy him and delight in evil about every negative headline coming out of Woodward's and Bernstein's typewriters there at the Post. The worse the news, the happier they were. Then on August 12, 1973, Chuck Colson became a Christian. Parked alone in his car in a darkened street outside of the home of Christian friend Tom Phillips, he found himself weeping and surrendering his messed up life to God. Well, during the months that followed, he found to his amazement that many of his former political enemies became his friends. Envy vanished. These men and women weren't delighting in evil, rejoicing in his legal problems, the indictments he faced. In fact, toward the end of Colson's jail sentence, fellow Christian Al Key, a congressman with 20 years in the House and sixth-ranking Republican, offered to petition the president so that he could finish out Chuck Colson's term in prison for him. Listen, that's 1 Corinthians 13. And I'm the first to admit that with a pang of sorrow in my own heart, I don't fulfill that to the level that Al Key did. I have a lot of confessing to do every evening before I go to bed. But when we truly understand the Christian message, when we grasp that we are all God's children, all equal at the foot of the cross, all equally undeserving, but equally the recipients of grace, then we begin to grasp and maybe even experience the death of envy, our fixation with the bad news of our enemies, and our grudge nurturing. Without a doubt, it takes a miracle. But it's a miracle I desperately want in my own life. Chuck Colson wrote later, "It was almost more than I imagined possible, this love of one man for another. Christ's love. Al Key would give up his whole career. Doug Coe would lay down his life. Graham and Harold too. Isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that the overwhelming gain of knowing Jesus Christ, which makes all else as loss? And this day I knew him, Jesus, as never before." The Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary on verse 6 adds, "Love does not rejoice over the vices of others or find happiness because others are found guilty of wrongdoing. It does not take malicious delight in hearing a report that someone has erred. The unsanctified heart is glad when an enemy falls into sin or when an opponent makes a mistake that involves him in disgrace, but not so with love. It takes the opposite course and seeks to help even an enemy when he is in trouble." I have to confess that such a picture of love, agape love, even begins to permeate my understanding of great Bible pillars and truths. In my own Adventist denomination, as we explore all the texts that deal with the question of hellfire and punishment, this picture of biblical love is certainly a part of the equation. True, the Bible must be allowed to say what it says. And hellfire isn't the topic of this devotional today, but the Lord doesn't delight in punishment. We who are believers need to prayerfully learn to delight in conversions more than in the threat of flames and destruction. No matter how busy he was, C.S. Lewis took time to graciously answer all his mail. And the responses just to one woman were later published under the title "Letters to an American Lady." Now, she must have had real difficulty with resentment and the sins of some particular people, because in a postscript Lewis added to a letter dated October 28, 1960, he wrote, "It's useful to think either X is not so bad as, in my present anger, I think. If not, how unjust I must be. If so, how terribly X needs my prayers." That's a beautiful approach for the Christian to take. May God help us to truly love one another.